In the beginning of Plato's Republic, set in around 440 BC, we are greeted with a description of young priestesses performing horseback acrobatics in the service of Athena. Similarly, Xenophon's Symposium, set in around 420 BC, gives an account of female acrobats performing for Athens' philosophers. The motive of the female juggler or acrobat, like the great Hellenistic minds of Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, is one that was heavily influenced by prior Oriental thought, namely that of Egypt and Tyre during the later stages of what is referred to as the Orientalizing period, when Egyptian and Levantine culture dominated the Mediterranean. To the Egyptians, who saw the cosmos as an integrated whole, juggling was seen as a participation in the dance of heaven. Where to the Egyptians the jugglers were seen as performers of the cosmic rhythm, in ancient Greece the motive took on a new dimension. Places imbued with female jugglers often depicted scenes of idleness, laxness, and joviality. The woman is focused on her work, which requires skill and focus on the one hand, but is unproductive on the other. However, the repetitive and unproductive pursuit of the task doesn't seem to bother the woman, and when she is given a productive task, she prefers those of repetitive nature, such as weaving. At first, this seems like a stark contrast to the Egyptian concept of the juggler being engaged in a cosmic act. However, the difference is simply one of perception. From her own perspective, the idle juggler is experiencing flow, a perfect sync of conscious and unconscious that devotes itself fully to the activity at hand. In her act as a juggler, the world around her seems to fade away, as only the balls in her hand seem to remain in existence. Her horizon now becomes limited, but in return she is able to have this reduced heaven meet her circumstances perfectly, and so she experiences the meeting of her inner heaven with the inner earth. Consequently, she doesn't feel bored, even though she isn't doing anything productive. The motive of the juggling woman thus is always the same motive, an idle and equanimous look at destiny from the outside, where the ups and downs of life flow together into a simple play we perceive from above. It is therefore the same motive as the Moirai, or the spinning woman, who, in her activity, fashions destiny in a wholly unencumbered and lofty way. It is a motive that values femininity in light of motherhood. It is the mother whose lap we can return to in times of need and in times of plenty. A kind and generous keeper of the home who cares for us through the ups and downs of life. It is therefore unsurprising that this is a motive we can even find applied to the Virgin Mary, especially in her pregnancy, where she carried heaven within her. And yet, the Greek depiction of the juggling woman also points out something else about her. She is fully removed from the society around her, inculcated, isolated, because, even though she has a heavenly experience, that experience is an esoteric one, an experience of the heaven within, and she is only able to be this way as long as an outer heaven isn't intending to actualize her.
回到原位，再次摔倒，没有关系。但是我们看到，实际上我们能够看到这个咏春的实战能力啊，实战能力，挺好，真的不错。好，专业表现，这是一个李成啊，击倒，不要再打，不要再打，好，不要再打，差一点，差一点，差一点啊，差一点。
These videos of Kung Fu masters being pummeled by professional fighters became quite popular in the Western world during the 2010s. The main reason was a disillusionment with the East, which had, hitherto, been seen as almost culturally superior to the West. These Kung Fu masters had their claim to fame mainly through Hollywood and wuxia culture, which thrived upon their philosophy. And this combat philosophy is by no means ill-fitted. It outlines the ups and downs of combat, the fluid transition from offense to defense and back to offense, It connects the flow of battle to that of history and the universe. And yet, when it comes to actual combat, it has a critical flaw. It doesn't take into account the fact that the opponent has their own agency. By taking a bird's eye view, it becomes useless once dragged down into the dirt. Having built their own heaven, the masters forgot that the opponent could levy a heavenly act against them. That of actualization.
Risk getting knocked out! Oh my God! Wow! Anderson. Oh, he got hit! Look at the finish it! It's all over!
We must have a winner all the way to by double has got there.
In his book, Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson proposes that there are two general ways in which people perceive the world. One as a place of things, the other as a forum for action. In the book, Peterson suggests that modern society suffers from an inability to see the world as a forum for action and only sees it as a place of things. However, the degree to which this is actually true can easily be put into question. We are, after all, a society that obsesses with the technically correct over the generally correct. For example, the Big Bang Theory is a technically correct description of the universe, but it holds little general meaning. Similarly, human evolution is the most technically accurate description we have for the origin of our species, but when people try to derive general implications from it, they almost universally fail. And this is not something foreign to our elite class either. In The Alchemy of Finance, George Soros writes, "Scientific method seeks to understand things as they are, while alchemy seeks to bring about a desired state of affairs. To put it another way, the primary objective of science is truth, that of alchemy, operational success." And yet, if we consider the proposition again, we notice something interesting. The previously described method of substituting the general for the technical can be described as equivalent or even equal to the process of rationalization. By describing things in terms of their earthly components, we are able to pretend that they have no direct heavenly component, no meaning. Though realm for action and place of things may be bad signifiers, we can describe the world either in terms of essences or accidents, of actualizers or potential, of meaning or of objects, of heaven or of earth. The realm we want to map then is categorically different from the one we are used to thinking about. In fact, the realm we seek to enter is one in which thinking is not a neutral term. Non-physical existence cannot be quantified like physical existence, but before taking a look at these non-physical existences, we have to take into account that these can exist on different levels. The most immediate level is our own inner heaven, the mind. The form of non-physical existence within the mind is often understood to purely be our own ideas. But in actuality, our entire experience of reality is non-physical, which can easily be proven by pointing to experience-altering substances such as LSD. Therefore, we are something living inside our own head. Our head then may even be called our own Plato's cave, but the way we transcend it is downwards, not upwards. That is, man should try to get down to earth instead of up into his own head. To illustrate this further, we will now introduce the realm of the square kingdom and the circular forest, or the point and the periphery. Like all things, the mind has a center and a boundary. Humans relentlessly try to give an order to the world we find, to make sense of existence. In the pre-modern West, this mental state was mirrored by the world in which people were born. Villages, castles, cloisters and cities were small enclaves of order surrounded by chaotic forest. This forest was eternally encroaching on the community, which had to beat it back and slowly expand into it, inch by inch each year. A community that fell into disorder for an extended amount of time would even be consumed by the forest. Yet, the fight against the forest also brought its own reward, as its spoils, wood, bark, sticks and foliage were all essential elements for the day-to-day life of pre-modern man, Since the woods were also frequently used to bury or hide treasure, it wasn't unheard of that someone would make a lucky find. The woods were both a realm of grave danger in the form of wild animals, thieves, escaped convicts, and lunatics, as well as great wisdom and inspiration in the form of, for example, hermits and natural groves. Our inner order is within our unconscious. The conscious mind is the mediator between inner order and outer world. This, however, does not mean that the conscious is necessary for contact between the unconscious and the outer world, as might be illustrated in things such as blindsight, a phenomenon where a person can unconsciously catch a ball, for example. Either way, the unconscious needs the outer world to grow. For example, mother and father are the categories the unconscious will always seek to fill, but the things from which these archetypes derive their character will be entities that the person has encountered in their own life. Most dominantly, in this case, their own parents. In early stages of development, a child would therefore treat the parents as deities, or perhaps we may say that man treats his deities the way he treats his parents as a young child. And this relation is circular. By observing how a culture treats its deities, we also observe, for example, its parental relationships. In pagan cultures such as Hindu, ancient Roman, or Buddhist cultures, having a heart-to-heart with one's own father is very unlikely, because the pagan metaphysic doesn't really allow the stepping down of the father to this degree without falling into complete chaos. In the same breath, talking to a pagan deity and simply reporting one's fears, worries, and day-to-day life would be seen as almost blasphemous in these cultures. The individual's concept of father is then, on the one hand, an amalgamation of father figures it encountered over the course of its life, or in other words, an abstraction. This, on the other hand, however, does not mean that these abstractions are arbitrary, even though they can take on almost every shape based on what they drew on. They have to be fitted into a greater order to make sense, and in this regard, not all conceptions are equal. The inner conception then stands in constant interaction with the outer world, it shaping one's understanding of the world, and the world shaping one's understanding of it in circular fashion. And the wider the circle gets broken out, the closer to truth this conception can potentially become. We like to think, however, that our minds were made for truth, but rather they were made for fitting into an environment. If this environment is the truth, that is the heavenly kingdom, all is well, but all earthly kingdoms fall short of the heavenly one because of man's fallen nature, and so he has to levy the cause of the fall, transgression, to transgress out of the earthly kingdom and into the heavenly one. This was typologically enacted in Exodus, but is the task of each of us with the kingdoms of our own time. And the supreme trickiness of this task is that we are at the same time necessitated to humble ourselves before these very same kingdoms. An interesting thing about beehives is that, save for the queen and drones, all other bees are incapable of reproduction. From an evolutionary perspective, that gives us the question of how such an organism as a worker bee might be able to evolve, since each organism is said to evolve through reproducing. The simple answer is that the individual bee should not be seen as its own organism, but as a sort of limb of the beehive. The beehive, as an organism, then is what we would call an emergent property. That is, the beehive is an entity that is greater than the sum of its parts. The functioning, moving, expanding, and even construction of the beehive is something that no individual bee has any competence in, and which rather results from the interaction of the hive members. One prime example is the perfect hexagonal space allocation of honeycombs, which doesn't come about through central planning on the side of the bees, but rather through the pressing against each other of round combs, the tension between the overlapping circles naturally shaping them into hexagons. The beehive as an organism cannot be split into its bee parts. Instead, the beehive as an organism is the outcome of the interaction between the bees. As such, it has no physical dimension and becomes our second heaven, the collective heaven. The collective heaven then itself has a passive and an active side, a relative heaven and a relative earth, of which we first describe the earthly component and then build up from there. To come back to our allegory, the interaction between bees is mainly facilitated in two ways: through pheromones and through what has been called dancing and can be thought of as mimed instructions. It would be tempting then to reduce the organization of the beehive to the pheromone print it possesses at a given moment. However, both the pheromones and the so-called dancing only are able to act as information carriers because they mean something to the individual bee. On a human level, we then also need a realm of interaction to form emergent properties, which of course, primarily, though not exclusively, is our human language. To grasp the concept of language from this perspective, we first need to consider that humans naturally organize themselves into what we will call hermeneutic groups. That is, cells of humans that collectively explore the world, trying to bring forth the norms that correct the inner heaven's abstractions of archetypes, as we just discussed for the inner heaven. These become new square kingdoms radiating out into the circular forest, which would be the world beyond its members. Each hermeneutic group also brings forth its own culture, but that will be a topic for a later video. For now, it suffices to say that culture is a byproduct or accident of the hermeneutic group's true purpose. Each hermeneutic group, be it a circle of friends, a church community, a nation, a family, or a sporting club, is organized around a central property we will call a group merit. The group merit is a type of good that organizes a group's hierarchy. Furthermore, meaning, the central node of necessity for the use of language, also heavily interrelates with group merit. A crass but pregnant example from our contemporary world would be the N-word. Wider Western society has a central merit that carries a strong non-aggression aspect to it, as said to be exhibited by its proclaimed people of highest virtue, Gandhi, John Lennon, and similar. The capacity of the N-word to cause strife and disagreeable sentiment makes it a condemned word in the wider society, and its employment is sure to damage one's reputation and social status, as one now openly proclaimed a non-cooperation to the group's merit. In dissident groups, on the other hand, the central merit carries a strong aspect of dissent from mainstream sentiments, and so the uttering of the N-word shows extensive cooperation with the central merit and is capable of increasing one's status. As such, even though the word carries some common meaning between the groups, it ultimately has a different meaning in each. The merit always has to be a good. Easily identifiable aspects of a merit for illustration of this include beauty, physical fitness, wealth, or the ability to make someone else feel good in a social interaction. However, for any of these to be the only merit of the group would have to have no common concept of goodness with regards to the other aspects. That is, if a group's merit is only beauty, then the group has no common experience of the good aspects of wealth, physical health, social communion, or anything else that is capable of being good. This is because the group's merit naturally is the highest point of shared goodness between its members, and as such, in a sense, a mystery. However, the group's merit is always incomplete, and it is this incompleteness which fractures groups and makes them into individual cells radiating out against each other. And even if we were able to unite all people into a common group, that group's central merit would still be incomplete, as was seen with the Tower of Babel. There is of course a perfect merit structure called the grace economy, which is the merit structure of the kingdom of heaven. In it, the hierarchy is determined by one's fullness of and cooperation with grace. The relevant merit is God, whose essence is perfect goodness itself, which means that he is the highest possible and only righteous merit. And from this can be seen how Christianity has a rightful claim to unite all the world behind it, whilst any other attempt at world unison or peace can be seen as equivalent to blasphemy. From this perspective, we can also see how Lucifer can act as an angel of false light. For example, sex is good, and in the pursuit of it, man ultimately is in the pursuit of a good. However, the expectation can be twisted, and so, for example, the mind can be tricked into believing that sexual conquest is of increasing goodness. That is, the more sexual partners the better, and this is an aspect typical of the group merits of young, inexperienced men, for example, which therefore combines ascension in the social hierarchy with lasting damage to the self, as the increasing amount of sexual partners lead the soul into more and more confusion. The group and its merit structure are in circular or hermeneutic relation to one another. The merit informs the group and the group informs the merit. So, for example, the merit shapes the group's language, which gives the group new ways of expressing itself and interacting with one another, which gives new light to the merit as well. This shaping of language also serves to drive the groups apart, as groups tend to develop their own languages, at least in part what we call slang, or even fully once sufficiently estranged from one another. This can make two people who nominally both speak English incapable of talking with one another because of the groups they come from. Here again, the ultimate meaning of words becomes important. Meaning might better be explained through its German translation, bedeuten, which is a combination of the prefix be, which means inflicting the act after the prefix on another subject or object, and the word deuten, which simply means pointing. So the meaning of a thing is just what it ultimately points to. The Divine Liturgy, for example, only becomes meaningful if it is understood that, and how, it points to the supreme reality of Christ. The group merit, as a type of grace, can also take up the place of grace for the individual. Thus, just as individuals can cooperate with grace in order to advance themselves in the celestial hierarchy, or, in other words, become saints, so they can cooperate with merit to advance themselves in the social hierarchy. This is also where the brain's ultimate goal of fitness comes into play. The evolutionary instinct of the brain is not an accident, but in every kingdom that isn't the heavenly kingdom, or in every environment that isn't the supreme environment, fitness then is a double-edged sword. And so it is played out in nature, where organisms that adapt to specialized niches may in turn lose central capabilities to survive in more generalized environments, which leads to almost immediate extinction if the niche stops existing. So, be aware of the Reaper who brings groups to their end and fashions new groups from them. All temporal hierarchies are ultimately doomed to fail, and so the first will be the last, as those who have given themselves up fully to a group merit structure will remain barren once it becomes obsolete. A consolation for the Christian will be that, statistically, he will be better off than average, since his cooperation with full goodness also means that he is at least in partial cooperation with every group merit, because a group merit should have at least some points of goodness in it, which, per essence, are reflections of the full goodness of God. Especially in the long run, the Christian thus floats to the top in a Joseph-like fashion, and thus we see saints more often being successful and admired people rather than lifelong social rejects, although they also, by virtue of ultimately being transgressors against the world, almost always build up some kind of strong enemies who, not uncommonly, have a hand in a saint's untimely end. And in civilizations whose merits are sufficiently perverted, being a saint might even mean that there's no other option but being rejected by society. Yet these societies are also always only a short while away from collapse, and then the last will become the first. However, groups do not go silent into that good night, and this is where the active part of the collective heaven comes into play.
I'd say if you want to reserve egregore to those things, those processes that are self-organizing but are not autopoietic, then that is exactly where the boundary of agency is lost. The tornado is self-organizing, and that to me is what's happening in Tiananmen Square. You're having a social tornado, but it is not autopoietic in that it does not self-organize in order to seek out the conditions that produce, promote, and protect its own existence. Whereas I take it that hyper-agencies do. So an example of a hyper-agency that clearly does this is a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies, in fact, often become totally just self-perpetuating entities that have been self-organize for this telos, but the autopoetic element takes over, and sometimes to horrific degrees. That's in Kafka, right? And so I'm now seeing a continuum. But to me, the line where we ascribe agency is precisely the line of where the self-organization has passed properly into being autopoetic. And when there is no evidence for autopoiesis, we should not ascribe agency. And when we can ascribe very sophisticated self-organization. And if that's what people want to point to with the term egregore, then I think it's a good term for that phenomenon.
To describe the active side of the collective heaven, we will use the occult term egregore. The idea of the egregore is the idea of a group or collective giving birth to not just an emergent property, but to an emergent agent, or a being in itself that has its own soul. A soul then is classically defined to be present with every living thing, which just pushes the question further onto what life is, with there being two alternative definitions that we will both take into account. The classical definition is that life is present if movement is present. This does not mean that everything that moves is alive, but rather that life is what is responsible for all movement, thereby effectively rendering life as a sort of power or force. In our context, that force is the group's merit. The second, more contemporary definition is that life is present where autopoiesis is present, which is the ability of a system to maintain itself by creating its own parts. Here we have a differently tiered system of life. The individual can be seen as alive since he produces his own cells through nutrition, whilst, for example, the species can also be seen as alive through sexual reproduction. To map the egregore then, we will first outline 4 variations of unions. For comprehension's sake, the egregore can also be simplified to the will of a union. The first version is the accidental or mechanical union. Here the group is united through its accidents, that is, things that do not relate to the essence or nature of the group's members. The merit is meaningless and union has to be enforced externally. We cannot speak of an egregore. These groups can be described as mechanical because they function like machines whose parts are selected to fit together for accidental properties such as conductivity, and who have to be repaired manually from the outside in case any part breaks. For example, groups that are put together because of their height or last name fall under this version. These groups can still exhibit movement and/or autopoiesis, however, in both cases it will be the result of a third factor that is not part of the group itself. For example, the group tall people will have a regenerating number of members, but this is not something fostered by the existence of the grouping of tall people. Similarly, they may also have an animating effect on the environment, for example, causing artisans to build higher door frames, but that too would have to happen regardless of the existence of a grouping or not. If these tall people started taking pride or liking in their height, either consciously or even unconsciously, and advocated for such changes in doorframe height or were influenced in their choice of partner towards having taller children, the group would fall into one of the other 3 categories. The second version would be an unconscious union. This is what the previously mentioned beehive would fall into. Here, the merit is participated in by the members but not consciously understood by them. Examples from the human world would be the aggregate of a country's fishing enthusiasts. In individually pursuing the merit contained in the hobby of fishing, these men can have a collective effect as an egregore, which seeks to further said merit. This great fisherman, for example, may enlarge his territory by bringing forth more and more dedicated fishing zones. He may grow out of control in something like a fishing mania, and he exhibits autopoiesis through his members' ability to recruit new members into the hobby. A more prescient situation from the contemporary world is the managerial revolution. Managers don't conceive of themselves as a group and yet collectively act towards common merit, which exhibits, amongst other aspects, efficiency, stability, and presentability. This common movement of the great manager makes the world more managed and thereby creates an environment in which managers thrive, reinforcing the great manager in turn. And this self-reinforcement again means autopoiesis, which wouldn't be present if the success of the great manager had as its effect an environment hostile to managers. If these fishers or managers, however, become conscious of their existence as a group and start conceptualizing themselves as part of it, we move on to the next version. The third version then is a semi-conscious union, and by far the most common version. Here, participation in the group as something larger than the self is understood consciously, but the merit is hidden, meaning seems to be lacking or discordant from the group. To illustrate this, let us first return to the example of the fishermen. The fishermen each individually pursue a merit that is contained within fishing. What precisely this merit is not important, but we can note some of its aspects, such as serenity or achievement once a fish has been caught. By becoming aware of one another and their shared practice of fishing, they might seek to unite into a club in hopes of more deeply pursuing their merit. The club can act both as a vehicle to further pursue the merit of fishing, such as by giving fishermen access to spare equipment and encouraging exchange of knowledge, but also as an immersion spring of further aspects, such as companionship. Into this club, new members may join who do not seek the fishing aspect of the club's merit, but the companionship aspect of it. The merit exhibited by all members now is not the one contained mainly in fishing, but one contained mainly in the social aspect of the club. The identity becomes confused because even though the club is understood as a fishing club by all its members, its real merit is mainly exhibited as a social gathering place. The members know that they are part of something larger, the fishing club, but there is seldom or even no experience in actually participating in something larger. Although the group usually has some notion of a central merit, within it there exist multiple merit tendencies that can steer into different directions. The group may now be perceived as a collection of sub-egregores dominated by one master, the dominant egregore. The typical and supposed master is what we will call the nominal egregore, which is the one the group is perceived as. In our prior example of the fishing club, that egregore would be a type of the great fisherman. The nominal egregore can be usurped, however, at which point the outer representation of the egregore either changes, or the new dominant egregore wears the old nominal egregore as a sort of skin suit. The nominal egregore is how the union represents itself, and thereby the starting point for the formation of the concept of the union within the mind of its members. This conception can then become part of the inner world of the group members and other observers. The disconnect happens through the previously mentioned usurpation or just the existence of tension between the group's entourage of sub-egregores. Many such unions are easily observable in the contemporary world. The academic community, also often simply referred to as science, has a nominal egregore that holds truth as a central merit, yet its dominant egregore is oriented towards social prestige. The usurpation began when a social prestige dimension was added to the scientific community, namely in the form of Nobel Prizes and other awards. Contemporary businesses have a nominal egregore that seeks to further their profit, however, are actually oriented mainly around power, as power serves the core merit, of which profit was an aspect, better. And the identity of those core merits may hopefully become clearer a bit later in this video. This mismatch can then be the source for a lot of false action, as the collective, or in a wider sense the earthly, can only connect to the self-presentation of a thing, not to its essence, just as man can only get to heaven through the incarnate Christ and not by himself. So the collective will act under consideration of the nominal egregore, even if individual members among it wisen up to its false image, as long as the dominant egregore can keep up appearances. These actions, however, also mean that the nominal egregore lives on as a phantom through its imprint into the collective mind, and can even thereby resume his position. Here it should also be noted that a second layer of intelligence, mentioned in 0.3, also comes into play. Although technically present wherever humans communicate, the network effect of human communication really becomes a point of central importance once humans start identifying themselves in groups. The input and output structure of the network, with the caveat that every node is at once an input, output and hidden node, forms a crude neural network, which thereby forms a weak unconscious. This unconscious is the group's general mentality, and thereby sort of colors inner group interaction. This unconscious is part of the dominant egregore. Furthermore, the dominant egregore can become capable of what we may consider intelligent perpetuation through possession of his members. This is given when the existence of a group in itself is part of the group merit. A classic example would be a firm's department whose sheer existence is an underlying necessity for its merit and resulting aspects such as social prestige and money. Members of the department can become intelligent agents towards the department's perpetuation and growth in pursuit of the merit. Other types of this union are families and countries, where group identity is easily established, but group merit is very hard to identify, and even structures like the market or the stock market, whose egregore, often called the invisible hand, is identified and openly discussed, but whose central merit is up for much debate, speculation, and disagreement. Within these groups, there's often a sort of merit mysticism, where individuals strive towards its core, soul, essence, meaning, true identity, or whatever else they may call it. Doing so, they attempt to purify the overlapping sub-egregores into the point of their overlap in order to try and identify a central or grand or general meaning, which is also necessary for the final version. The fourth version is a fully conscious union. Here the group is focused consciously around a central merit, which thereby both becomes the group's animating force and is actively, autopoetically, perpetuated by virtue of the group members upholding the merit. To illustrate this version, I want to first give an urban myth from the United States. Reportedly, President John F. Kennedy toured the NASA facilities during the space race. There he encountered a janitor doing overhours. Perplexed at why someone would put in extra hours to such tiring and unrewarding work, the president asked the janitor what he was doing. "Mr. President," answered the janitor, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." Regardless of whether this story is actually true or not, it illustrates how the egregore of the janitors has submitted itself to the greater egregore of the space program. This way, the egregore of the janitors is set up as a reflection of the greater egregore. Even though he has his own merit, exhibited mainly in cleanliness, the greater merit of the space program shines through him and elevates his own merit into greater importance. From this, naturally, a hierarchy forms that is oriented around a central merit, which supplies derivative egregores with meaning through relation. For humans to consciously participate in this, the egregore needs an emblem, or sign, to communicate its own presence. Classically, these mainly were banners, but nowadays they have gotten a new name, logo, which derives from logos, meaning in this case the word, and functions, unsurprisingly, as a type of Christ, who, as the word or logos, is the face of the penultimate merit, his essence, God. In this light, it also makes sense to briefly consider clothing. Clothing is always something provided by the heavenly to the earthly, which is also why women feel so comfortable wearing their boyfriend's sweaters. The wider reason is that clothing provides identity and serves as a form of communication of self. That is, our character is reflected in how we dress. Just as merit informs meaning, so it also informs the meaning of clothing, thereby giving way to ritual clothes and uniforms. Although uniforms do already exist on the level of an unconscious union, we may go back to the example of the fishing club and designate fishing gear as their uniform. Only for a conscious union, however, are they designed for a purpose that is complementary to the operating of the union, and thereby can be seen as widely respected. The exemplary conscious union is the Church. She is consciously directed towards God as her central merit and, through her excellence, sanctifies the world around her. The Church brought Western culture its glory through her excellence. She elevated the West further than any other civilization, not even trying to do so but simply pursuing her central merit, which was the peak of goodness itself. As such, she may be described as having an egregore, that egregore simply being said communion, which is also the environment that she created and which is the environment which reinforced her. A second example may be the aforementioned space program. Its central merit, with aspects of a great cause and doing what has never been done before, and deeply intertwined with the act of setting foot on the moon, was powerful enough to illuminate a vast array of minor causes into a conscious union. However, now that the moon landing has happened, creating a similarly powerful conscious union under the same banner would be impossible. The moon landing only made sense as the expression of a deeper merit, which it, upon completion, lost touch with. Before we continue, a small excursion has to be made regarding the nature of evil. In the interest of time and focus, I will abbreviate the definition of evil we will use here and have instead put a complementary philosophical treatise in the description of this video for the philosophically minded, those who might want to challenge the definition. We will start from the classical definition of evil as not truly existent and instead being a lack of good. That is, evil does not exist, there only is privation of good. This definition, whilst elegant at first, throws into question why evil behaves like it does. Let us take disease for example. If a person suffers from disease, then it would be nonsensical to say that they suffer from, let's say, a mere lack of breathing, because said lack of breathing did not come about by itself, but rather by the disease. The disease, however, is not a lack of anything, and thus we could not declare it evil. Furthermore, a lack of something cannot be the cause of something else. Evil we will therefore declare as a real property in things, this property being to cause a lack of something. Disease, that causes a lack of breathing, may be declared to be evil. If we go back to the example of the fishing club, we can see how evil, as a concept, comes into play with regards to the egregore. By forming its split identity between a social gathering place and a unity dedicated to fishing, the club's egregore can now push towards the privation of either of these goods, becoming therefore evil towards it. As already mentioned, there has to be a central good that both fishing and social reveling have in common. At the very least, pure goodness itself, as both of these are of course goods and therefore must hold that goodness in common. However, rededicating the club towards that central goodness is often unrealistic, as it would typically also entail a transformation of its members to identify and, on an emotion level, experience that goodness as something not necessarily constricted by the goods they seek. Those goods again being fishing and social reveling, which ordinarily doesn't happen. This leads to a conflict which needs to be resolved. The role which does this resolving is the role of the judge. This role traditionally is exhibited by, for example, kings, religious authorities, family fathers, or even men of great trust or renown. However, it is not a necessarily fixed role, and so, absent this role, or in the presence of an insufficient one, politicking becomes the chief discipline where all members strive to tame the egregore for themselves. The conflicting sub-egregores become hostile towards each other, factions build and start devouring each other. It should thereby become easy to see how that hostility towards each other makes the sub-egregore potentially hostile towards the shared point of common goodness, in which is found truth. and this hostility to truth becomes something fostered in the egregor's members who, nurtured by the egregor, will relate all things relative to the goodness they come to know through it, thereby also making them potentially hostile to truth, if the egregor has sufficiently isolated itself. Contemporary society tried to game the system by making it so that egregors could not isolate themselves. However, all this does is that a new and complete good, openness, takes the reins over society, and since all goods that are incomplete can, by themselves, only lead to deterioration, the Western world deteriorates. Many of the central ills befalling the West today, over-immigration, hookup culture, which can also appropriately be called rape culture, administrative overreach, the increasing drive to recruit people into more and more extreme political niches which demonize the common man, and a complete lack of understanding for personal and local heritage or idiosyncratic communal identity and spite for any sort of exclusivity are all just emanations of this central dictation of openness, which does not allow anything to restrict access to itself. Thus we see how the egregor, by itself and removed from all central goodness, becomes nothing but a mechanism for its own enlargement, effectively running on inertia like cancer cells which mindlessly duplicate and thereby harm the wider body which ultimately sustains them, dooming themselves to death. The egregor, now reduced to an engine of unchecked growth, can only be described as a disease and thereby identified as being evil. It produces a rotten culture which can be understood to feed on its members and thereby turn them into what we may describe as zombies. Unconsciously, the West identified this fate in the 2010s during the big zombie hype, and just that fate came into full fruition during the end of the decade. And the solution identified by artists towards the fictional zombie apocalypse is also the solution to be levied against the world of today. To first build close communities of heavily restricted access to survive, keeping out both the infected and all other hostile people, and then to slowly recapture central points of importance whilst also working on a cure. Ideally, these communities will be the churches, but this is more of a first come, first serve kind of deal. In regards to zombies, their devouring nature may also be noted, which is the nature of all things that feed on something which is not eternal and inexhaustible, and which also therefore is characteristic of all egregors removed from the central good. The egregor then cannot be described as intelligent. It may be able to leverage the intelligence of its members through its ability to possess them as they are enslaved to the perceived good. However, it has no intelligence of its own to speak of. It is, for example, impossible to hold a conversation with an egregor directly. Thus, even though the egregor is in a sense larger than man, it is still below man, like a mammoth or a tiger, which, whilst being stronger, still ultimately find their place below us. In the church, for example, its egregor cannot at all be equated with something like an angel, saints, or even Christ, even though it too is to become, in a sense, Christ-like. This brings us to the interesting conclusion that the congregation itself is actually lower than its members. There is speculation of a realm of the psyche. This realm, often called the collective unconscious, in reference to speculations made by Carl Jung, is said to be accessed by the human mind, typically in dreams, and is a sort of collective space for all human thinking. Such a realm could potentially explain certain phenomena, such as an unusually intense thought of a loved one, some experience when said loved one dies far away. Taken like this, such a realm would be the host of a humanity-wide egregor, a quite literal zeitgeist. However, from our contemporary perspective, such a realm wouldn't be much more than the internet already is. Additionally, however, there are then many other attributes identified with this or a similar realm: the ability to foresee the future, the ability to tap into a cosmic meta-energy or other unknown forces, the ability to shape destiny, astral travel, the conjuring of spirits, conversation with the dead, crystal healing, pyramid power, sacred geometry. All these are sometimes associated with this realm or each other. Having looked at the mind and the hive mind, we are now taking a first glance at the outer heaven. The first issue here is to separate the outer heaven from the outer earth. As the outer earth, we will simply denote the crudest and most obvious simple form of the earthly, matter. To cut things short, we can simply observe that matter is governed over by the laws of physics and the fundamental forces: gravity, electricity, and the two nuclear forces. The reason why some believe science to be at odds with faith is that they believe these laws and forces to be the extent of the metaphysical. And there is a sense in which they are heavenly, being non-local and omnipresent, timeless and inviolable. There is also a sense in which photons are metaphysical, since they do not possess mass themselves. However, before we judge on these things' heavenliness, we first have to recognize that they are not the most fundamental we can go. We still haven't reached the outer bounds of physics. The necessity of an information dimension is something inherent to physics. The question, however, is whether or not said information is just an abstraction, so a description of physical properties, or existent as a real property that can be said to be out there somewhere. The physics community is generally split on this question. A growing faction believes that information is the basis of reality and, for example, tries to resolve the biggest problem in contemporary physics, a disconnect between quantum mechanics and general relativity, by leveraging information theory. The circumstance that information theory is also the basis of computer science is where the universe is a simulation hypothesis comes from. For our purposes, as we will see, it doesn't much matter whether an information basis of reality is true or whether it is, say, string theory. But since there are no philosophically powerful alternatives to the idea that the fundament of our universe is something that can be treated as information, we will proceed with it here. There are two main topics that are typically considered when it comes to the interaction between information and physics. One being that black holes are able to break what is otherwise called conservation of information. That is, black holes destroy information if they evaporate. The second, somewhat related issue is the interplay between information and thermodynamics, more specifically, time. Time is a topic we will dedicate a later video to, but for now gloss over some of the more crude details. Time is linked to the flow of entropy, or the tendency of any system to devolve into a monoform blob with no outstanding characteristics. One of the simplest examples is a deck of cards. If we buy a deck of cards, it will initially be in one order. After lifting the ace of spades from the top and seeing the two of spades, we will know how the cards progress from there on. As we use the deck, that order dissipates and the deck can now be said to have achieved maximum entropy. Looking at a card now gives us no hint as to what the next card will be. The issue is that there is no obvious reason why ace of spades, two of spades, three of spades, and so on is the deck being in order, but ace of spades, king of clubs, seven of diamonds, and 10 of hearts is disorder. Out of the trillions of permutations a deck can take, what makes some ordered and others disordered? As already alluded to, the order comes from the ability to infer from one element onto all the others. An ordered set is one that is easily navigable. The cards are a beautiful example here because they have different amounts of orders depending which way they are turned. From the back, all permutations are equally ordered. From the front, only a few permutations of the cards are so. If you wanted to study the possible relationships between the cards' faces, many patterns would be expressed using mathematics, which also relates to the study of order, but which we will also reserve to a later video. For now, we will only say that mathematics, which deals with quantities of things, only works if you have something to quantify. So, for example, we quantify 3 cars as 3 cars, and not as 12 wheels. Similarly, information theory, for purposes of real use, requires what is called a many-sorted logic. which is a hierarchy of categories that retain and inherit attributes that separate them from each other. So, for example, a dog is not a cat, but derives common attributes from the identity of animal. In classical philosophy, centered around Plato and Aristotle, these are typically called essences and can be described as that which makes the thing that which it is. It should be noted that, although some argue otherwise, the most workable concepts of essence are those in which essence is that which makes the thing that which it is, rather than that which makes the thing that which it is, meaning that essence relates to the being's core but is below existence itself. But before we can ask what something else really is, we first have to ask what we ourselves are. That is, we cannot separate our experience of reality from our experience of ourselves. And there is a very simple reason for that. So far, we have only sketched the interaction between the inner heaven and the outer heaven, so as to be able to describe the inner world. Now we will do it with the consideration of the outer. The mind is not passive in letting itself being filled in by the outer world. Rather, it projects itself into the outer world in an attempt to perfect itself. In this, it tries to make itself in the image of the outer world. However, it is not a purely passive element in this. It simultaneously acts in the world, changing it, questioning it, and even reversing the dynamic and building the outer world in its own image. This way, man and creation have a hermeneutic relationship, creation forming man and man forming creation. Thus, all work on the self that isn't also work on the world is fruitless, whilst all work on the world that isn't also work on the self is destruction. This is also why humans project, and as such also the reason why the flaws we quickly find in others are actually those we have in ourselves. From this, we can also see how others accusing one of things that don't make sense or obvious mischaracterizations actually reveal their own flaws. This is also a strong theme in the New Testament, where ultimately the perfect man becomes the perfect screen for the projection of all flaws of mankind, assuming the form of an arch-sinner on the cross while being fully blameless. By accepting the projection, accepting the accusation of a God-defying wastrel, he sanctified it, and through this sanctified all men. We partake in this act typologically whenever we accept another's characterization of us, but then, being unencumbered by it, surpass the other's expectation of us and thereby necessitate them to readjust. This is also why human relationships can steer us much more than other things, because in the other we now see in parts ourselves, but also have taken them into ourselves, so their behavior becomes part of us. This is also why in wanting to fix ourselves, we develop a desire to fix others, which can take up the fully fledged presence of a fetish or perverse desire for broken people, and I have linked in the description an excellent video on the contemporary e-girl phenomenon for further exploration and clarification. A video I only want to prime with the statement that it is always the female's despondency to thus be projected into, and the male's despondency to thus project. And what you see in the video is just that dynamic turned rampant. The image in which man shapes creation is that of his inner heaven. Here the roles we spoke of before, which the mind fills, are what is nowadays called the archetypes, and which are also the previously mentioned sub-personalities. When we speak of archetypes, we primarily speak of personalities like the sage or the trickster, but there are also other existences that appear archetypically. Few examples include types such as the road, the earth, the tree, the amulet, or the sword. However, when broken down deep enough, these also seem to be mere aspects of the archetypes. The earth becomes the Earth Mother, the road becomes an encounter with a trickster, the tree becomes an old sage, the amulet becomes the tear of a beautiful goddess, and the sword becomes the inheritance of an old king, for example. Archetypes form on a very much experiential basis, so the identity of the archetype is heavily interacting with personal experience and mostly flows into personal action, as meaning on a personal level always carries an action component into it. Or in other words, the archetype, to a large part, is what it does. The reason for this is that archetypes are formed from memory. This is another topic we will gloss over for now, but suffice to say that memory as a function of retrospectively highlighting the essential or important aspects of what went into creating the present day, working anachronistically backwards from the effect to cause. It heavily interacts with dreams and storytelling. This is why, for example, in a story, Chekhov's gun must have been fired by the end, because for a story, only the important parts are included, and this behavior is also shared with that collective memory that is called history. Memory, ultimately, then serves the identification of causation, and that is how the action component forms. Archetypes are constants because humans ultimately experience the world on the basis of constant forms of experience. Or in other words, by the existence of archetypes, we know that each person's experience of existence isn't wholly unique. That is why archetypes are so important to storytelling, which ultimately is an act requiring communion or coming together, and also reveals why they have such religious significance. Because the divine too communicates itself in a way that is intelligible to humans. This, of course, perfects itself in Christ, who, on the one hand, told stories to make his teachings understandable to the people he spoke to, but who, furthermore, himself was acting out just such a story personally, namely his own life, which too is one of his teachings made understandable to man through the incarnation. Archetypes also play an important role in the act of common reality creation, which we will also reserve to a later video, but which is responsible for the paradigms which pervade the collective heavens. The word archetypes is not arbitrary and hints us at their being. That is, archetypes are types of arche, a Greek word meaning beginning, origin, or first cause, denoting the root of all things that exist, but also the method of their origin and disappearance. During the Orientalizing period mentioned in the beginning of this video, Pre-Socratic thinker Heraclitus pointed out that all things were in constant flux, in constant change, in constant flow, not unlike the spheres held in motion by the juggling women, though his most prominent example was a river, producing the famous statement that one cannot step into the same river twice. It should be noted that this is not a description of what the river is removed from human observation, but one of how man is to understand the river. But change itself could not be arche, because change wasn't arbitrary, and thus a director of change, a master of flux, was identified, Logos. This concept found itself back into the Levant, where philosopher Philo penned a proto-Christian account of Logos as the connecting entity between God and man, written likely only a few years before the start of Christ's ministry. And as synonymous here can also be seen the Chinese Tao, which Sun Tzu credited with group cohesion. As such, we see the Logos permeate all the mappings we made so far, putting the self in order, putting the group in order, and putting the world in order. Only with this in mind may we approach essences. Another way we may describe essence is as that which is unchanging about a thing. A man may change everything about himself, but at the end of the day he is still the same man, his essence remains the same. But this constant identity may still just be something that the mind assigns to the outer world, keeping us thus trapped in our own inner heaven. And what is the knowledge of essence even good for anyways? What is the essence of essence? Let us take the ship of Theseus, one of the most prominent thought experiments for the conceptualization of essences. We will look at the variety where the ship is sitting in port and is being replaced piece by piece, with the old pieces being saved and, after the replacement has taken place, reassembled into a second ship. The question being, what is now the ship of Theseus? Trying to gauge this from an independent, third perspective, objective or neutral, we seem to get stuck. Arguments exist that it is the red ship, the black ship, that every permutation of pieces during the replacement process is actually its own ship, and so on and so forth. In a previous video, I have mentioned how in a materialist mindset, the atoms in our body changing actually is a huge issue, and we are looking at very much the same conundrum here. I have also mentioned that this is not a problem for an idealist mindset. To illustrate this, we first introduce various characters. We propose, for example, that the ship was given by a captain for repair, and the shipwright constructed the black ship as practice for himself. In this case, both in the eyes of the captain and the shipwright, the red ship is the ship of Theseus. We can construct different scenarios, for example one where the shipwright rebuilds the ship to prove to the captain that there was no need for fixing and thus believes the black ship to be the true one. But regardless of which way we spin it, from the perspectives of both parties, the ship is what it does for them. A quick side note is that this way we are already at a point where we cannot fully be removed from reality because, for example, no belief in the ship as a gardening tool is really feasible, as the ship cannot do what a gardening tool is supposed to. What these men have done is that they have drawn upon an exemplar in their own mind. The reason why we as an outside observer don't have an immediate identity for the ship is that we do not have an appropriate exemplar drawn up. An exemplar may properly be described as the form which something imitates because of the intention of an agent who predetermines that end. For example, if an artist draws a portrait, the form imitated is that of the person whom the portrait is drawn of, and the agent is the artist. Similarly, when a mother instructs her child to behave more like the best student in class, that student becomes an exemplar. And when a young man tries to copy the mannerisms of a movie character, that character also becomes an exemplar. We now have together all the elements discussed in the video so far. The categories of the mind, group merit, essences, meaning, all connected. Therefore, to declare an objective essence, a being of a thing in itself, is to declare the perspective of an outer holder of these essences, an outer mind. Historically, these were relegated to gods. One of the most basic forms of religiosity, for example, is that a god is invoked to provide that outside standard to the formation of a contract, something which could alternatively become the role of an authority figure, such as a king. But in this way, there are as many truths as there are gods and kings, and the degree of one's truth is only their power over others. Or in other words, objectivity and monotheism are, ultimately, the same thing. Let us go back to the ship of Theseus and just pretend that we are the Logos for a second. One of the sleights of hand that are part of the ship of Theseus thought experiment is that we are already given a full ship in the beginning, with no explanation of how that ship came to be. This is important to point out because what we are really observing is again Heraclitus' flow. Being the Logos, we are the one who directs this flow, and we do so by assigning essences, as essence is that which isn't changing, or in other words, we direct the flow simply by declaring what we believe the ship of Theseus to be. Being human, what we are actually doing is simply assigning that which we believe to best match the idea we were given in the beginning, because that is the exemplar we go of. By being given an already existing ship of Theseus, we just reveal in our final choice what we believed the original to be. A quick side note here is that we can also see from this that the exemplar isn't the essence, but both essence and accident together. So now we can start sketching out the divine mind. Like the human mind, it casts itself out. It does this in various limited imitations of itself. Limited because each imitation cannot be the whole and must as such, in some capacity, be limited. Thus, the divine mind casts itself out into a fracture of mirrors of itself. These mirrors being what is called the divine ideas. These, it should be stressed, are not divinity itself. To levy a more theological advanced definition of God, God is the knowledge of all the things he could actualize. Divine ideas can take on various degrees. Those of genus, such as animal, those of species, such as dog, and those of the individual, such as the dog Fido. Only on the individual level are they exemplars, as only there they are instantiated by the divine mind. So the divine idea of something concrete is the example in which the thing is made. The divine idea of a thing, however, isn't the thing in itself. Let us take the ship of Theseus, for example. Even once we've decided which is the ship of Theseus, in both spirit and material, we still cannot take that identity out to sea. We would still need the real thing. This becomes more important with sentient things such as man, which can imitate their divine ideas or not. Thus, the divine idea of each person becomes their way of participation in the divine mind. By perfectly imitating the divine idea, one therefore becomes a possible perfect exemplar to others. As in using the imitating person as an exemplar, the other uses the same exemplar the divine mind used. And now we can cast down the whole chain of being again. We humans can also produce our own ideas. Let's say of who we want to be, cast them out into the world, for example through stories or in performing them, and have others use them as exemplars, imitating them and thereby participating in us, creating the collective heaven whilst simultaneously transforming themselves. We do so in an act that is evil in the way previously described. We do so in an act that, by the casting out of the idea, creates a not previously existing lack in others. That is, for example, in casting out an idea that in some crucial capacity is inimitable, or in other words, a lie. Thus, cast into the collective heaven, the lack-creating attribute of the evil exemplar creates room for disunity which, if becoming too strong, drives the egregore apart and thereby potentially affects the individual mind's ability to set itself in order, thus resulting in a pantheon of gods, split up groups and confused individuals. And with this we get to the fall at Babel. In the ancient world, the fall at Babel was taught as the reasons why there were many gods, many nations, and many languages. But this is by matching other biblical passages, like Deuteronomy 32, with the only very quickly described event at Babel. This is important because we very likely identify Babel as a historical event, but at the time people were already present in other parts of the world and other languages were already being spoken, although we know very little of the religious practices that came before it. Instead, Babel serves as an especially pregnant illustration of the mechanism by which the ancient world state of many nations and many languages was achieved. The general exegesis is that the Tower of Babel illustrates man's attempts at getting into heaven on his own terms, to self-glorify, to live according to unlimited desire, and in all this to finally, and most importantly, put God into a box. Before we go on, I have also put the article of a friend who is an architect into the description of this video. He writes on the meaning of the bricks in the story and gives as such a lot of additional valuable insight. But with that said, let us now consider the Babel story in depth. The structure that is nowadays identified with the Tower of Babel is called Temple 1 in a city known as Eridu, one of the earliest in southern Mesopotamia. Even though the Bible passage gives only little information, the temple at Eridu fits them all, making it very likely that this is the structure referenced. The structure we now call a tower is actually a ziggurat. That is where the reaching heaven part comes from, since ziggurats were believed to connect heaven and earth, and often said to reach heaven. What made this ziggurat different can be seen in the biblical text with God that what they had achieved was effectively omnipotence, or, in other words, having taken over the heavens and now being an authority of all change. Whilst normally a ziggurat was a place where divinity was believed to step down to humanity, this case was one of humanity violently striving up. The deity of the ziggurat was a god called Enki. On his Wikipedia page, you see him equated to the Greek Poseidon and Prometheus, but just as crucially, Enki was associated with the planet Mercury, whose deity in Greek was Hermes, and Enki shares with Hermes also the attributes of trickery and wisdom. Combining these three attributes, Enki functions almost identical to the spirit Mercurius of later and contemporary alchemy. All of this comes together in him being the patron deity of sorcery. So far, although of course feeding in Christian commentary, I have tried to give a general account of the heavens that is mostly neutral. The inner heaven, collective heaven, and divine mind can all be seen as empty categories in themselves that don't have any attributes besides the ones specifically assigned to them. Sorcery, for the purposes of this channel, will then be simply defined as all practices based upon the ultimate conception of an unintelligent divine mind. We will also define intelligence here as the ability to deliberately make things previously uncovered about the selves hidden, and or being able to hide things not supposed to be uncovered. So a man, for example, may be able to realize that others think he is a glutton, and so, being intelligent, deliberately modify his own behavior in order to change the other party's perception of him. For God, this means confusing the other's conception of the divine ideas, which means, as hopefully becomes clear from everything that has been said so far, amongst other things, confusing the other's language. So what does it mean to deny God such intelligence? Let us for this first look at a few typologies of the Logos that are static, such as Mandala, Kabbalah, the Taiji Shuo, the Celestial Lodge of Freemasonry, or even the monomyth. These, effectively, are all systems that relate their own versions of the divine ideas toward each other. So, for example, the Tree of Life in Kabbalah has 10 spheres called the Sephirot, which, for our intents and purposes, are the divine ideas in Kabbalah. The lines between them exist to illustrate the relationships they have with each other. Having previously noted the Logos to be the director of motion, we see how in this case it seems as if the lines direct the motion as a sort of track to flow across. So in other words, divinity now becomes a sort of force that has a certain pattern of flow to it. An eternal presence within which the universe endlessly plays, like the balls in the hand of the juggling woman. All conceptions that exhaustively describe the outer heaven as unintelligent we have glossed over so far, such as the collective unconscious, a spirit realm like Aether or Akasha, energy realms of either an unknown energy or of those energies in physics, photons, information, string theory and its vibrating strings, or the Kabbalah, all of them ultimately break down into this, and indeed, we can designate this concept of the divine mind as feminine as well. It is, after all, a resemblance of an unconscious, a mere flow of energy between unintelligent nodes. We will call this conception of the divine mind Akasha Matriya, a flanderization of the divine mind where instead of substituting its technicality to its essence, we declare its essence to be the product of its technicality. We have turned God into an animal in our minds and must thus, by the dynamism so often now described in this video, become animals ourselves. Should this flow of force be entirely unpredictable, then we are simply taken for a violent shake amongst the tides of the universe, subject to brutal and, ultimately, inescapable chaos. Should it be predictable, then we can master it. This is where sorcery's common association with fortune-telling comes from, for example, because if you know the present and you know the force which progresses it into the future, then you know the future as well. An illustration here would be the stock market, driven by millions of transactions every second, subject to an unconscious collective force, mastered by people like the alchemist George Soros, who, through use of special knowledge, attempt to not just divine the future more accurately, but to actively shape it. We can see how Akasha Matria, just like the stock market, can be described as having a will of her own, but that will can be steered towards whichever ends those desire that sufficiently understand her behavior, because Akasha Matria, once captured, has no capacity to wiggle herself free of her own volition. And because they can steer Akasha Matria in such a sense, they now effectively produce divine exemplars, making themselves thereby divinity. Like with the unmastered egregore, politics now becomes the finest art, as each individual is now incentivized to dominate each other and Akasha Matria. Those who are reductionists have a problem that they have no perfect exemplars to hold to. Those who engage in attempts to master Akasha Matria develop a similar problem. The solution is the same. They take their own being as the highest authority and, even if not necessarily consciously, thus declare themselves to be God. Religion becomes subjective in this frame of mind. Organized religion becomes a power play, dogma an illusion. The optimal strategy for the individual becomes hiding their knowledge of Akasha Matria, cloaking her in mystery, not unlike an insider trader on the stock market. An eternal battle for the role of master ensues, endless, useless war for the role of dominus, the antitype of which is simply hell. This general notion has become the underlying framework of most of contemporary storytelling, and on screen I have just put a random sample of examples I could remember from the media I came across in my life. Something we'll call fractal reverb and discuss in a later video, this outer environment incentivizes accidental unions in groups and, on the individual level, a fracturing of the psyche. The union and communion fracture, the pagan world ensues with many gods, many languages and many tribes. This is not to say that a communion of all peoples would eradicate these differences. We do not have to unite the fishing club with a chess club in such a way that both activities must be done together. We can simply unite them so that they are part of one organization. We do not have to unite all people into speaking one language or being of one tribe. In fact, the most successful empires are those that seek to preserve local identity. So we should see the separation of the tribes as that which it is, an act of God's mercy. In Eridu we see one of the, if not the first attempt at mass civilization. As the precursor to Babel, it may be seen as the first attempt at empire as well. We also see what is effectively the first instance of a mass-produced good in baked bricks, being able to be cast to form. Similarly, Eridu would have been one of the, if not the first place of such a size that there was room for anonymity between its members, which necessitates conceptualizing the other person without knowing them. The apostles and church fathers said that Babel was a place that valued bricks over people, and now we can see how. Because they had reduced God to concept, and thus unpersoned him, they would also come to reduce people to concepts and unperson them. Or perhaps it went the other way around. They made God a system, and they made all the world a system by extension. They had already doomed themselves to violent fracturing, but in his mercy God preempted this by a premature fracturing and a scattering of the people around the world. By having to learn another's language before speaking with them, we are forced to come to understand their perspective, their way of life. By speaking different languages, we are forced to leave one another a room of freedom. By speaking different languages, we are not born into an endless sea of humanity, but into our own tribe, able to journey into the outer forest and not being placed in its midst. By speaking different languages, we are forced to come together on essential things first. By speaking different languages, we transcend entropy.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half-sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."